Today's discussion is about changing gender norms for women's economic empowerment. Gender norms we widely recognise as a barrier to women's economic empowerment, affecting their access to decent work and their experiences within the workplace. The norms help explain why women's participation in the labour force has stagnated in some contexts, and why women are frequently concentrated in relatively less lucrative sectors and occupations than men. And gender norms can also underpin harmful practices such as sexual harassment in the workplace. Around the world, some norms are shifting. Economic change and programs that support women in the workplace are both playing a role. And in some contexts, women are taking up occupations formerly seen as men's work, and in others, responsibilities for care and domestic work are starting to shift. But how far do examples like this represent sustainable change? The 2015 Beijing Platform for Action was in 2015 they did a 20-year review looking across all different sectors. And when I revisited that and looked carefully at it, it seemed to me that some areas were moving and we had made progress, but there were a couple of areas that really seemed to be stagnating. One was control over women's sexuality, and the other was women's economic empowerment. And in thinking about why this was, it seems to me that it's okay to make positive change in women's lives if you're not directly challenging power relations. The closer you get to the centre of power, the more difficult it becomes. And economic empowerment is a very challenging area, because it requires men in particular to give up some of the power and some of the dominance. And so we see, sort of control over ownership over property, for example. It requires sharing. And I think that's one of the reasons why norms in economic empowerment are really difficult to shift. There are other factors, but I think that's one of the reasons. And the 20-year review revealed shockingly slow change. Over 20 years, the previous 20 years in fact this was 2012, the gender gap in the labour market participation narrowed by just 2 percentage points. And in Southern and East Asia, the gap actually grew wider over this time period. It would take 75 years at that pace to actually achieve any equality. So this is a really, really slow area of change, which is why we've been looking at the effect of gender norms in this area in terms of keeping change slow. So we drew on the results of the new research by the Growth and Economic Opportunities for Women programme, GROW. This was funded by IDRC, and GROW spanned 50 countries, and the work we did explored how changing gender norms can lead to women's economic empowerment, drawing on that research programme. So for the panel today, we're delighted to be joined by Rachel Marcus, who's a Senior Research Fellow in the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion team here at ODI, by Chidi King on my left here, the Director of the Equality Department of the International Trade Union Confederation. Aran Dahan, sitting in the front row here, who will shortly be giving some remarks, is the Director of IDRC's Inclusive Economies Programme at the International Development Research Centre, and commissioned this work from us. On video link, we have Marilyn Mungereza, who's the Country Manager at TechnoServe Inc. in Uganda, and Emanuela Pozan, who's the Senior Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination Specialist at the ILO. And I also would like, apart from welcoming all of you here, to welcome our online audience. Join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Shell's Equal, she is equal, and make sure to tag us at ODI Dev. I think that's on the screen, actually. Yeah, it is. So first of all, I'll introduce Aran. ODI is obviously delighted to be working with IDRC on this topic. Aran is the Director of IDRC's Inclusive Economies Programme. He leads a multidisciplinary team to strengthen policy research capacity in developing countries on issues of economic policy, governance and health systems. Previously, he's led programming on poverty reduction, employment and growth, and prior to IDRC, who was Social Development Advisor at DFID for 10 years, working especially in China and India. So can I invite you to come and give some initial comments on this work?
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's great to be here. I had prepared remarks. Of course, I lost my notes. Plus, I walk in and I see so many old friends that I've got to say something very different anyway. So, but stop me if I take too long. So it's a pleasure to be here. I've known Caroline and Rachel for a long time in that time that I worked at DFID in the UK, and many people in the room here. So it's a great pleasure that we could collaborate on this. So IDRC is a Canadian part of the Canadian International Development Program. The great success that IDRC work has. We actually predicted the last Canadian general election, out of which came a feminist prime minister. So the impact of our research. This, of course, was a correlation, not causality. That's what the footnote says. But to be serious, of course, it's a great, working in Canada now on the topic of gender equality. Of course, is a great privilege, and we want to make sure that what comes out of that in the international community, that we collaborate with major players in the UK and elsewhere. And again, that's why it's such a great pleasure and honor to be here to be part of this conversation on this research findings. The program that we led within, so IDRC is a part of the Canadian Development Program that supports good research for development, but primarily researchers in the global south to build up capacity to do good research. And as part of our programming, we build up this program, which was called GROW on Women's Economic Empowerment. Important to say it was IDRC that implemented it, but it was co-funded by the UK. The UK's Department for International Development. It was managed by Bernadette, who's sitting here, and also the Hewlett Foundation. And working in that partnership was very important for IDRC. So we managed to fund some 14 research projects, as Caroline said, that ended up working in some 50 countries. And I'm not going to talk to you about the results that came out of that, except to say one or two things. One, we had a great component or a cluster within that focused on the care economy, where the research showed, and it was across 5 countries, where the research shows that women's time burden remains a very important issue, as we all know. But it also, that's incredibly important in some of the women's economic empowerment programs that we support. Through those programs, women's time burden continues to increase, and that has a detrimental impact on well-being of women and their families. And this is as important, we also showed that it is possible to invest in publicly funded childcare. There's a demand for and a possibility to invest in publicly funded childcare in low-income contexts in a way that is not only good for women but also for the children, and also has an economic benefit. The other area that we focused on, and that was less clear in terms of results, but something that Caroline referred to, is issues of labor market, where the research showed, as we all know, the specific barriers that women face, particularly in contexts where there are few good jobs available. The women's labor force participation is not increasing. That segmentation in labor markets is getting stronger. Basically, that the SDGs around women's labor force participation are not being met at the current context. We don't have equally good evidence on what to do about this, and this is an area that we're looking to explore further. So these are just the 2 things, and that large research program, it's on our website, and please have a look at that. I have some material with me. Now, why this meeting? Well, at the end of the program, and we had this large diversity of research project. By now, Rachel, how many papers did you review? Some 50, 60 papers that were there at the end of 4 years of research. And we said we need to synthesize that for the global community, as well as those specific pieces of research. And one thing that we felt, and what Rachel and Caroline looked at, is like in all the, I'm going to exaggerate slightly, I'm not going to steal your thunder, in all the research projects, it was on women's economic empowerment, all the research projects came out with the conclusion that social norms are really, really important. none of the research project went much further than, I think, than saying that norms were so important. So there's a crucial part of the research agenda that we really, at that point, we felt we had this feeling, it's like, is there enough on social norms? And that's why it was so great to work with Caroline and Rachel on this, is really to out of this fairly large research portfolio, what do we know about social norms and what do we need to do further? So I won't say anything more. I'm really, we've read many drafts of it, but I'm really interested to hear how Rachel is presenting that and how, what the reactions are of the panel. And again, thank you so much for entertaining us here and collaborating on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move straight into the presentations and discussions. I'll just introduce each speaker as they come up. So our first speaker is Emanuela, who is online. She's Senior Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination Specialist at the ILO, covering a portfolio of initiatives in the area of access to women, care economy, pay equality, violence and harassment in the world of work. She's got many years' experience working in the Middle East, Africa and Asia on women and workers' rights, non-discrimination, disability and labour migration. She's also worked with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, NGOs, UNFPA and now the ILO. So, Emanuela, I'm going to invite you to give a talk. I think you have some slides which will be appearing on the screen.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So good afternoon to all of you and warm greetings from Geneva. It's a real pleasure to be joining this forum. I would have loved to be in London with you in person and to meet you all, but unfortunately I could not make it this time. And I do apologize because I will have to leave in 1 hour time due to care responsibilities. I would like to thank the organizers also for the opportunity provided to the International Labour Organization to share a little bit of an overview of the work that we have been doing in the area of gender equality in the world of work, and also the diagnosis of the current status, situation, and the future of the agenda of the situation of women in the world of work. Some of what I'm saying has already been touched upon in the introduction, but perhaps I can unpack a little bit more. As many of you might know, the International Labour Organization is about to celebrate 100 years of life. And we are expecting a big birthday party next year to celebrate the century. But this time of celebration has given an opportunity to really do a deep reflection on the work done and the remaining challenges. And the key question that we have been posing ourselves is, to what extent has the world of work been able to fulfill the potentials and aspirations of women and girls? And have gender norms changed vis-a-vis the world of work? And certainly, a lot of progress has occurred. We cannot deny this over this century, but a lot needs to be remain to be done. And the current trends has just been said, pose some important considerations that need to be made. So as you see in the first slide, according to the latest trends, the gap between women and men in the labor force participation is widening, and it has been widened for quite some time, actually, instead of closing, as we are aspiring in the 2030 agenda. As you can see at the moment, it is at 26.5%. We have more than half of the women population globally that is not in the labor force, compared to 1/4 of men. And overall, it is estimated that being a woman in this world, in this moment, is associated with 30% less chances of being in the labor force. This is certainly not a promising figure for any woman or any young woman that wants to enter the labor force. Yet, if we look at the aspirations and attitudes and perceptions of women and also of men vis-a-vis the preference of women to work, It's clear that the research says, and we had a Gallup report a couple of years ago that confirmed that most women prefer to be working, and the majority of men agree with this preference. 70% of women and 66% of men would prefer women to be in paid jobs. And even when women in households where it is not acceptable for women to work outside the home, those women, 1 in 3, would like to be in a paid job. So women want to work, men agree that women work, but only less than half of the female population is in the labor force. And when we unpack this, second slide, please. When we unpack this, we all know the many, many different reasons why women's possibilities are limited in entering the labor force, from lack of safe transportation, unequal pay, lack of good paying jobs, unfair treatment, etc. And all these factors vary according to the level of development of a country or the age group. But there is a common denominator that is across the world, and it's the main challenge is for both women and also for men is balancing work and life responsibilities and family responsibilities. The International Labour Organization has a convention 156 that is very clear in its message. It's about workers with family responsibilities, and it calls for states to put in place those measures necessary to support work and family balance. It's about childcare, but it's also about infrastructures. It's about services, social protection, etc. It's not by chance, by coincidence, that this convention is not widely ratified, because this convention poses really, the key issue of unpaid care work. It poses the need for a major transformation. When we look at care responsibility, we are talking of, as our presenter said before, we're talking of shaking the power relations. The ILO has recently produced a care report. It's a very thick book, actually, but it has some very key messages. So if we look, next slide, please, at unpaid care work, what is the magnitude globally of unpaid care work? So in 2018, 16.4 billion hours are spent in unpaid care work every day. This means that 2 billion people are working 8 hours per day for free. And we all know, as it was also said, that it is mainly women to perform unpaid care work. 67.2% of the total amount of unpaid care work globally is done by women. This is an area, unpaid care work, where there hasn't been enough progress. Actually, progress has been very slow. And if we look at the trends, it will take 210 years to close this unpaid care work gap. So in reality, I think only our grandsons and granddaughters will live in a world where both men and women have an equal share of unpaid care work. And this will be probably in 2228 if we put in place a real transformative agenda. In fact, we all talk about the fourth industrial revolution, but what is needed is really a revolution that puts at the heart of change the change in this power relations. Only when women and men will have an equal share of unpaid care work, it will be possible for women to be fully present in the labor force. I'll leave it here because I know that time is very short, and I'll be available for questions.
Great, thank you very much. If people have clarification questions, they can ask them now, but I'm planning to take all 4 presentations and then have a discussion where you can ask more specific questions. So only clarification at the moment. In which case, I'm going to move on to Rachel Marcus, who's giving the next talk, and reviewed all of these research studies that were undertaken for their content on norms. Rachel's a senior research fellow here at ODI in the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion team. She's had more than 20 years' experience as a researcher with a special expertise in rigorous evidence reviews and a strong focus on gender, childhood, youth, adolescence and inclusion. And she's co-leading many of our work streams around evidence synthesis. So Rachel, I'll pass on to you.
Thank you, Caroline. So after the overview that Emanuela's given, I'm now going to go into quite a deep dive into what the GROW studies revealed about gender norms and their impact on women's economic opportunities, particularly in the areas of access to work and workplace experiences. The slide summarises the different areas where we found that norms are important and so the pathways that they affected women's economic opportunities. I'm not going to attempt to talk to all of them, but I'll just pull out a few of the key issues that we found in these studies. I mean, social norms are important because they're fundamental to achieving gender equality in economic opportunities. They structure access to resources, they affect opportunities to develop skills, they affect time use and divisions of labour, as Emanuela made very clear with the graphics that she's shown, and they affect people's abilities to act on the opportunities that may or may not be there for them. One of the key things we found, which was a surprise, but perhaps not given the context of the lack of progress in women's economic participation, is that all the norms were constraining. We might have expected to find a little more of a balance, that maybe some norms were facilitatory in some way, and enabled women to perhaps undertake certain areas of work, but pretty much everything was constraining. In some cases, women were directly banned from doing particular kinds of work. As a group, for example, there was just a total prohibition on them being involved in underground mining. There wasn't like a formal prohibition by the mining companies, but it was an agreement that it was just wrong for women to be underground. That was not suitable work for them and they shouldn't be there. Or as one women engaging in farming and small business in Uganda said, my husband dictates the kind of work I can engage in. He even restricts me on the number of hours I can work. And sometimes the restrictions were so internalized that women couldn't imagine doing them. The Sri Lanka study, which was looking at the economic opportunities of women in the northern post-conflict environment, most of whom were widows, and at the same time sort of couldn't imagine doing work like driving a three-wheeler to enable them to get to more markets, to be able to sell more products, because that was seen as totally unacceptable for women to do. But more common than those outright bans, there was gossip and undermining and challenging women's reputation and their morality and their housekeeping skills, and labelling them as not a real woman. So again, a woman in Uganda said, well, I go and do tin mining, I can't provide that care to my own children. I think that's where I've deviated from one of the key makers of a real woman. A real woman digs and grows food crops and feeds a family, but for me, I buy food using tin money, and that's abnormal for a real traditional woman. And for some of the women in the study, in the different studies, there was clearly an impact on their psychological well-being, but not for everybody. In some cases, they also felt, as well as the hostility, a sense of empowerment where they were blazing a trail and gaining a certain degree of respect as women who were, despite all the odds, working in things like mining and running successful pit shafts. It was clear that for many of the women, the restrictions stopped them from being able to access as good education as their male peers, but also, and I think that's very well known, but also it really undermined their access to more informal skill building opportunities, partly because of care responsibilities, partly because of mobility restrictions that meant they were just out less in their surroundings, able to engage less with other people, and not able to take up opportunities that were being offered to men. And obviously in many of the study contexts, there weren't a load of opportunities being offered to anyone. They were poor contexts where nobody had many skill building opportunities, but where they did arise, women were less able to take them up. And as a result of this, they were concentrated in less lucrative areas of work. So, for example, back to the mining examples, they were more providing, they were doing things like washing and sorting, which was paid less than the actual taking ore out of the ground, or they were providing food services, sometimes sexual services, that were less well paid than sort of the more heavy mining type work. Or in one of the studies from Bangladesh, young women had perhaps been doing things like tailoring and carried on tailoring businesses after marriage, but they were prevented from going to market to get cloth to see what the new fashions and styles were. So all of that was being relayed through their husbands, and so they were less able to build effective businesses than if they had been able to go. I mean, they found creative ways around it, like communicating with customers through mobile phones, but it was not the same as being actually able to go see what the new fashions were, to be able to really meet that niche in the market. We found some evidence of intergenerational change. For example, particularly in terms of care responsibilities and changing attitudes. A couple of quotes from young women in Tanzania. The days when our mothers were to ask for money from our fathers, even for simple things like underwear, are gone. We need our own money, and this means that we should work. Or for me, who's gone to school, why did I go there? Was it to stay home and do what? Then why did I go? No, do you need to go to school to remain at home? Why don't you stay there from the word go? And they were really quite challenging of the idea that they should stay at home and not use their education. But there was a big disconnect with their father's generation, who were much more critical of young women who went out to work. And one young woman said, well, I think there's no big problem with working mothers, but my father, older people like my father wouldn't like to hear that. They think women must be goalkeepers, but I think they mean sort of keeping care of the home, and therefore shouldn't work. So women's attitudes, or at least young women's attitudes, were changing, and also among younger couples there was some evidence of norms starting to shift as well. So when, for example, women were working out in businesses or largely and had to be at market till late, or perhaps go on a training course, there was some recognition from their husbands, particularly in Tanzania and Rwanda, that men needed to take on other tasks. And one of the men said, well, according to the culture, women have to handle the home activities. That's according to the culture, but for me, I feel good when everyone gets involved in doing the care work at home. It indicates that everyone's got something to contribute to the family. But when it came to talking about this in a group with other men, this man and some of the others who had admitted to doing care work in private to interviewers didn't want to admit it in public. And similarly, a Nepali woman mentioned that when she asked her husband for help, her mother-in-law would criticise. When her husband offered to help, the mother-in-law would criticise, and other people in the village would ridicule them. And so although they wanted a more egalitarian gender division of labour, the social pressure not to do so was so strong. And we really saw that it was social norms that were stopping people perhaps changing to live in a way that they wanted to live, and in a way that would be more economically empowering for everyone. We also found fear and backlash related to change. A couple of quotes from Uganda. One was, economically empowered women are big-headed. They often divorce. And men are hesitant to have joint investments with their wives. Once a woman has got money, she becomes uncontrollable and disobedient. So there was a real fear in some contexts that women's economic empowerment could just go too far, that it was a change too much, and that change needed to be much more gradual or controlled by men, so that families were getting the benefit of the income without the empowerment alongside. And also one of the studies from Bangladesh also showed that people on the one hand appreciated the income from things like garment work, but often were very reluctant to admit that their daughters or daughter-in-laws were doing it, because the women involved were seen as too uncontrollable, and that if they went to the city and worked in factories, they would learn to be too challenging, and they wouldn't be docile enough to then be able to slot back into the role of a traditional wife. What the studies didn't focus on what really leads to change in norms. They were, as I mentioned, primarily looking at norms as constraints, but some of the issues that did come up through the more quantitative and overview parts of the programme pointed to the potential of legal reforms, but the necessity that additional work would go alongside to stop them being subverted, which came up particularly to do with women's land rights. that new economic opportunities can help shift norms up to a point, but the way that women are able to take them up is really profoundly affected by prevailing norms. So in Pakistan, for example, the researchers were initially quite surprised to find that there was a strong interest and willingness for women to take up training opportunities, but they had to be within the bounds of the village, and over that distance, then it became completely impossible. And likewise, norms about women doing childcare, when there was actually good quality and affordable childcare on offer, women were happy to take it up in Kenya and India and to make use of that. But it did have to be seen as offering them something worth doing in order to make the sacrifice of leaving their children with someone that they didn't necessarily know, who wasn't family or know to the same extent. So those are just a few snapshots really from the deep dive we undertook looking at those studies. And the next two speakers are going to talk much more on what can be done to change challenging norms from different perspectives. So I'll let Caroline introduce them.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. It's very those vignettes and snapshots take you to the heart of the norms and attitudes, the norms which are the behaviours and attitudes that people exhibit and the attitudes they hold, which stop actually people changing. So that's very useful. I just remind you, do prepare your questions for the discussion at the end online. Do be thinking about any questions you have, and you can send them in, and I will ask them on your behalf. Great, so now we move to Chidi. So Chidi King is the director of the Equality Department of the International Trade Union Confederation. It represents 207 million workers in 163 countries and territories. Prior to this work, Chidi worked as Equality and Rights Officer at the Global Union Federation Public Services International and as Employment Rights Officer at the United Kingdom's Trade Union Congress. She has a background as a lawyer and a trade union activist with a particular passion for equality, human rights and civil liberties issues. So I will hand over to you to make your comments.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering where you found that bio.
You can correct it if it's wrong.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was very generous. Maybe I should explain a little bit about what the International Trade Union Confederation is before I launch into my presentation. So the ITC, as was briefly explained, is an organization of trade unions. We bring together trade unions globally around the world. Here in the United Kingdom, the Trade Union Congress is one of our affiliates. In Canada, it would be the Canadian Labour Congress, for example. In Kenya, we have 3 affiliates. In Tanzania, you get the picture globally. And these affiliates altogether bring together around just over 200 million workers in an organized labour force. And of those 200 million workers, we estimate that probably around 42% are women. Our task really is all about decent work. It's about ensuring that workers who go out to work can earn a decent living, can earn enough to feed their families, can earn enough to put clothes on their backs, can earn enough to actually ensure that their children can have access to a decent education and therefore to decent jobs in the future. We are, and I won't hide or try to run away from it, trade unions are very often accused of being very much part of the problem when it comes to issues around social norms and gendered roles, and that we're told very often that we replicate patriarchal norms that exist in society. And to me, that is not a surprise. I mean, we are not somehow divorced from the societies in which we exist. So where you have gendered roles that are very entrenched, when you have social norms that are very entrenched, it's not that surprising that you will find them replicated in various institutions and organizations, including trade unions. That said, what I particularly am passionate about in trade unions is that women in trade unions are not passive agents. So we organize ourselves, we push for change within our own organizations, and we achieve change within our own organizations. So within the ITUC family, this global family, for instance, at the moment we have, as I said, 42% of our membership, which is female, roughly. And of that percentage, only, and I say only with some caution, 28% are in top leadership positions. But if you were to compare that with other gender mixed institutions or organizations, I think that would compare quite favorably. And that number is increasing because women are actively organizing, not just for leadership positions within the trade union movement, but also for transformation of the trade union movement. Which brings me to an issue that everybody, I think, has touched on, and this issue of gendered roles linked to care, because I think the issue of reproductive roles really goes to the crux of pretty much everything that we're talking about, to those power relations, to the power dynamics, to the opportunities that women have, and girls in relation to education that women have in terms of entering the workforce and gaining decent jobs in the workforce, but also the type of work women tend to perform once they enter the labor market, which again tends to be mainly in caring sectors. So it's either in social care, in education, in healthcare, but also in jobs that are perceived to be seen, that are perceived to be very female or feminine, whether it's sewing in the garment and textile industries, whether it's horticulture, whether it's agriculture. These are jobs that are perceived to be for women. So social norms really do impact very much the kind of work that women perform, and at the back of those social norms is this whole issue of care. And I think wrapped all in all of that, and this is also what trade unions are about, you've got to see the power dynamics in terms of the global economy, and the fact that we have a global economy, a very neoliberal global economy at the moment, that is predicated on having access to cheap labor. In order to maximize profits for global companies through global supply chains, you have to have access to very cheap sources of labor. And this is across the board for both men and women. But when you look at who is faring the worst out of all of this, it is women who are right at the start, at the base of those supply chains, and very often women of color and migrant women who are providing that very cheap, very often precarious labor that doesn't have any social protection attached to it, that has very little opportunities for mobility within it. And very often that labor is controlled through violence and harassment, which is another issue that perhaps we'll be able to explore a little bit during the conversation that we'll have. So from the IT's perspective, other than doing the work internally in terms of bringing women's leadership to the fore within our organizations, transforming those organizations, we've also had a very strong focus on the issue of the care economy. And over the past 4 years, I would say we've produced 2 reports around what investment in the care economy would provide, both in terms of jobs. So for example, our initial research showed that if you invested 2% of global GDP, of domestic GDP rather, in the care economy in the US, you would generate 25 million decent jobs. So not just any type of jobs, but really decent jobs. And that this would also have an impact on other areas of the economy, but would also have an impact on liberating women to perform decent jobs, liberating them from doing the care work that generally tends to fall on our backs when governments fail to invest in care services, when, as has been the case here, we have had austerity measures that cut back on those services that really tend to constrain women's access to opportunities. So for us, the idea of doing that research, and I think the research that the ILO has just produced takes that even further, but the idea of producing that research was to show investment in the care economy as just that this is not a cost, as it's often perceived. It's investing both in the economy, but investing equally importantly in people, and investing, again, equally importantly in gender equality, because this is a big area that affects women's access to all sorts of different things, including political life and cultural life and social life. So wondering how I wrap that up all very quickly, because I think I'm running short of time. In addition to the work that we're doing around the care economy, and I have to say that this issue about women's reproductive roles and where women belong in society, you've got to put it also in the context of what is happening politically at the moment. It's not for nothing that we're seeing the rise of these strong men across the world, and I put strong men in quotes. So in Brazil, we've just elected this crazy, misogynistic, racist, homophobic leader. I don't know who's listening on this, on this I wouldn't mince my words there. Bolsonaro, we've been living with Trump for more than a year now. We have Orban in Hungary. The list kind of goes on. And this is part of the backlash and pushback against the idea of where women, and I use women in all our glory, in the sense that we are not, of course, just one monolithic type of being, that women have all kinds of identities, characteristics that intersect, whether it's race, whether it's class, whether it's, migration status, etc. So in all of that, this pushback against women asserting their rights is playing out at that very high political level as well. But that brings us all back to the economy and the need, again, to have this docile, malleable, compliant, cheap labor force that is accessible and that is typified, I have to say again, in women. We, for the past 5, 6, 7 years, and I'll wrap this up here, have been working within the International Labour Organization, talking about gendered norms, to elaborate a convention. Emanuela mentioned conventions earlier on, which are international labour laws, international labour standards. And we saw the need for one, that is, the workers of the world saw the need for an international labour standard on gender-based violence. It's taking us right up until 2015 for the institution of the ILO, that's the workers, the governments, and the employers, to agree to work towards a standard to address violence and harassment in the world of work. So we couldn't even get agreement on a standard to address the specificity of gender-based violence. The compromise was that we needed to address violence and harassment in the world of work generally. Well, both men and women do experience violence and harassment, so fair enough. And we have, or we're trying to work towards a standard now that will have a particular lens on gender-based violence, because otherwise it really will not deliver what it needs to be delivered. You would think in these days of #MeToo, etc., this would be quite an easy task, that no government in the world was going to push back on this, that even the employers would say, yes, this is an issue we need to address. But as Emanuela could also tell you, this has been an incredibly difficult discussion. The first discussion was this year. We will try to conclude with a convention next year. But all that to say that this shows the kind of times that we're living in. Progress has been made in terms of social norms, in terms of changing gendered roles, but when it comes back to it, when it comes back to these questions of power and who can exert and wield that power, you feel the pushback and you feel it extremely strongly. So I think I'll stop there. I'm sorry if I went a little bit over time.
No, you're perfectly on time. Very good. Thank you very much. I thought your sentence that the economy needs docile, malleable, cheap, accessible labour force cuts to the heart of structural issues that really prevent us from progressing. Thank you. So our final speaker, Marilyn, who is on audio, not on video. So I'm going to move to Marilyn Mungereza. She's working as the country manager at TechnoServe Inc. in Uganda, where she spent the past 8 years supporting over 15,000 women, men and youth to build their skills and increase their economic opportunities. She was recognized as Employee of the Year in 2015 and was one of the 4 global recipients of the TechnoServe President's Award for the year 2016. She's also a lawyer with a degree in corporate governance and financial regulation. So I'm going to pass on to you, Marilyn, to give your talk.
A great good evening to you from Kampala. I'm very excited to be joining this panel for this discussion today. I apologize for the technology difficulty and it's an audio. I'll just tell you a little bit about TechnoServe as I dive into this interesting discussion. TechnoServe is a US-based non-profit organization currently celebrating 50 years in service to the developing world. We implement programs in agriculture and entrepreneurship, and currently I've been leading work in youth with girls and women's programming, so this is a topic quite close to my heart, so I'm very excited to be with you all. When we talk about work in the Uganda context, work for us really means agriculture. Agriculture because this is a sector that employs 70+% of the population. The sector is informal, it's not commercialized, as much as it should be, but it's best on the smallholder farmers. And while men own the land in the sector, women provide 75% of farm labor and 90% contribute 90% to farm labor primary processing operations, for example, threshing and winnowing and things like that. So women's participation in this particular sector is very high. The challenge lies with access to the proceeds of that labor. While women do the bulk of the on-farm production work, men take over when it's time to market that produce. Women often do not know the market prices of the produce and cannot ask their husbands what they sold for or where the money went. So they do not fully benefit from their labor. It's important to note here that men expect their wives to provide labor as one of the benefits of being married. And so that's part of where that comes from. So men do not feel obligated to disclose their agricultural earnings as the land is theirs, and therefore the produce is theirs. Money is often diverted to non-productive activities, leaving the areas like health and nutrition, the family, which is the women's domain, to suffer. As you can imagine, domestic violence is the norm in this setting. We talk about issues of access to land. Traditionally, land is inherited, and rarely is it passed on to women. Usually, women access land, with their husband or father's blessings or permission. But only does this limit the scope of what they can grow or use that land for. I mean, the lack of security in the land holding means that you wouldn't invest in long-term, high-value crops, for example, coffee. Rather, you'll invest in short-term activities, things like growing vegetables, growing mushrooms, keeping small chicken, and things that are easily moved in a short time. And this means that they also cannot use this land, for a mortgage to secure loans. So access to finance is also a challenge for women who have no title or ownership or control of land. We've also often observed this dynamic that women in our youth programming funded by Mastercard Foundation, women have lost a lot of their businesses when their marriages sour because of access to the productive resource. When they have no land, and the marriage ends, then ends their enterprise. And many times we've observed challenges where women are able to rise in spite of all this. When they have been able to achieve some level of success, we find that their marriages in turn also suffer. Or perhaps, it depends on how you look at it, they're able to escape from perhaps abusive relationships. And so the success of women is not often viewed positively in some of these settings. Our interventions usually focus on improving production and productivity of smallholder farmers. And given the dynamics I've just shared, we cannot ignore the gender issues. We therefore adopted some gender-based practices for our programming. And these are really simple things. For example, if you're really interested in helping to improve productivity, you have to target both of the genders. You have to target both partners for training. Ensure that you deliberately invite the farmer who, when you invite a farmer, usually men will show up. So you have to make an effort to say, we would like you to show up with your partner, with your wife. And so you have to make that effort. Also encourage them to make sure that they attend the training together. Because what we've also seen is that if one party is attending training and growing, they're leaving their partner behind, and this is not a good recipe for success. We also recognize and work around the barriers to women's participation, for example, the timing of the training. Because women, of course, we've talked about the unpaid care work. They have to take care of the household, they have to cook and clean and make sure everybody is tended to before they can do anything else. So if you wanted women to participate in a training, you can't have it first thing in the morning. She won't show up. You also have to consider that she'll hardly work alone, especially a young woman. She'll have her children in tow. So your training venue, wherever you select that place to be, needs to be near her home, but it's a walkable distance. It must also be child-friendly. When you organize a training, you must consider that there'll be children crying, the women have to get out to breastfeed and do things like that. So you must be very flexible as a facilitator to ensure that the women feel comfortable coming with their children. You encourage them to come with them, and you give them room to step out, feed, and things like that. When organizing training, you must also consider literacy. Many times, as we know, the statistics, women are left behind in terms of education and therefore literacy. So if you want the women to access content, make sure that it's friendly, and make sure you make provision for translation into local languages to ensure that they too benefit from this content. We also offer interesting modules like We Can Fly, which is an interesting, where we really envisage a bird, and we try to tell people that a bird needs 2 wings to fly properly. And we say in this household, each wing represents each gender. So if you want this family of yours to thrive, both of you must be able to be strong and active for you to benefit. Under the We Can Fly sessions, we conduct what we call safe spaces, and we give both the women and the men the opportunity to discuss issues and share cultural norms. For example, we show images of men carrying children or men cooking. Those often in the rural communities elicit, very strong reactions when people say, I can't be seen carrying a child. I can't be seen to be cooking. My mother will think I've been bewitched. This kind of strong sentiments mean that men will always leave this task to the women, and meaning that they spend the entire day from dusk till dawn, from the whole day, from morning to night, working on and giving this unpaid labor on the farm and in the household. And so we try to encourage the gentlemen to take on these tasks as shared work. This is just work like any other. It is not necessarily tied to a woman, just because she's a woman, she has to be the one to take care of the children. We show them that if both parties in this place are economically active, then the household benefits, and then the financial burden isn't on the man's back alone, because that's how they view it, never mind that they're getting the labor from the wives, but they feel obligated to provide money. But they do not realize that money is only there because of the labor of their wives. So we try to show them that aspect and the benefits that could bring. We also encourage role models to share stories, couples that are managing to work together, and where the men have given these women more room to really other talents outside of the home, and sharing their stories and how they have benefited with increased incomes and improved family welfare. We've had, the same observations from various projects in coffee. We run programs of coffee in Ethiopia, cocoa in Tanzania, cotton in Uganda. The observations are all the same. When you engage both partners in training, you improve communication, because now they both have information and they have something to discuss. They are both at the same place, at the same level. They can compare notes. This improved communication reduces inter-household conflict and reduces domestic violence. This increased transparency encourages joint financial decision-making, and this increases women's control of agricultural income and assets. So now that women are able to benefit more from their labor, they are encouraged to take on the new practices that we're trying to train, and this in turn has, those returns for them. By providing women with the same access as men to productive opportunities, we have seen up to 30% increases in farm yields and income. By implementing these best practices, techniques have seen positive impacts on agricultural production and women's empowerment across Africa, Latin America, and India. And we believe that men who have seen the value of their women being able to go out of their homes and doing some activity are likely to allow their daughters the same opportunity to go and learn, because they see the value in the improved skills and empowerment of a woman. So that we believe that next generation will be able to access education and support their wives, continue to support their wives to access other opportunities outside the home. I thank you so much for the opportunity to share this with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Marilyn. That was really comprehensive across a very wide range of issues that you're working on. So clearly you have to deal with the whole picture. Your connection was reasonable but not perfect. So hopefully we can put up much of what you've said online as well for people to access. So thank you all panelists for your contributions. We're actually going to open up now for questions from the floor. I do realise that in my enthusiasm to listen to the panel, I failed to introduce myself. My name is Caroline Harper. I'm head of the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion team here at ODI, and a principal research fellow here as well, with a strong passion for changing discriminatory gender norms. So please ask your questions. We'll take them in sets, and I already have some online, so you have some competition. So please do, let's take some questions from the floor. Oh yes, and I should mention that questions for Emanuela should come first, because she sadly has to leave us in very shortly. So if you do have specific questions for her, please ask them now.
Hello. Thank you for all the presentations. It's really informing for me. I have a question for Mrs. Cataneo. For the first table, for the labor force participation, did you take into consideration about the informal employment of women in developing countries? Because mostly we witnessed that, like the women work in household chores as a cleaning lady or nanny, but without any social benefits. So, and also the second question is what do you mean by unfair treatment? Because there's an unequal payment. So I wonder, what does it include, the unfair treatment in one of the categories? Thank you.
Could you just introduce yourself?
I am Gokce Baykal. I'm a freelance international development consultant working on cash transfers. Okay, thank you.
I think there was a question behind you.
Hi, I'm Kate Horsted from Age International. I think it was Chidi recognised that women are not just one monolithic group, which is a really important point. So my question is, how do we make sure when we're challenging damaging gender norms that we're also looking at those intersecting social norms, including those related to age and others? Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions from the floor here? Again, particularly for Emanuela. But if not, go ahead.
Sally Baden from Social Development Direct. Thank you for those presentations, really thought-provoking. It's a sort of huge area. I guess my question is really about how the panel, and I guess Rachel maybe, but also Chidi or anyone else, see the relationship between the changing nature of work itself and changing gender norms. I mean, I guess I'm going to leave it as open as that because there's lots one could say about it, but I'd just like to hear some reflections on that.
Okay, great. I'm going to take a question online about disability from Sylvia Cordia. In the research, have you come across examples of how women with disabilities can or cannot access economic empowerment? How would you analyse what is the share of gender v disability norms in influencing these situations? Are disability-related stereotypes having a less or more important role than gender social norms as barriers to economic empowerment? So we're on intersectional issues there. We've got a lot of online questions, so I'll ask as many as I can, but let's stick with those 4 for the first round of responses. I'll go first to Emanuela if you want to comment on any of those questions.
Yeah, perhaps I don't think it was addressed to me, but the point made on informal economy, certainly an extremely important point. When we talk about labor force participation and the gap, we're not necessarily looking at informal economy. However, one of the reasons why the gap in labor force participation is widening is because informal economy is growing, and a lot of women work in the informal economy. So there's a link there. Because the audio was not very clear, I'm not so sure I understood the question about unequal payment. But if it was referred to the work of the ILO, here we mean the gender wage gap, and the fact that the gender wage gap is currently at 20%. And it's something that we are really much working on because it's one of the it's very much linked to gender norms, and it's one of the reasons why women are also not in the labor force. Because as one of the presenters said, if there's no, or maybe Shidi said, if there's no advantage in joining the labor force in terms of good wages, then women would stay home. And there was also a question related to the changing world of work. The changing world of work is, yes, it's changing and it's changing rapidly, but we are not seeing the same changes happening to gender norms. or at least they're certainly taking time. And going back to the informal economy, if we wanted to be a little bit provocative, the fact that 2 billion people, the fact that if we were calculating the 16.4 billion hours spent in unpaid care work every day, and look at this unpaid care work as informal work that mainly women do, and if we were to calculate this at the minimum wage rate, we would be talking of 11 trillion US dollars that, you know, would be generated in the informal economy if unpaid care work was actually really recognized, accounted for, and therefore valued. I'll stop it here, and I do apologize, but I really have to go. I thank you, the organizers, and I also thank for the questions, and I really wish a fruitful continuation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Chidi if you want to make any comments on any of those questions.
I think maybe I'll start with the one about intersectionality, seeing as you also had an online question in relation to that. And I mean, there's no short answer to that, but the first step is actually being conscious about what you're doing and being very deliberate, if you like, and intentional about ensuring that you are looking at these different areas when you're addressing issues around equality and gender equality in particular. So to give a concrete example, in some of the work that we're doing around pay equity or equal pay for work of equal value, very often you have global statistics that are presented, whether it's a global figure for the gender pay gap or a national figure for the gender pay gap. And that doesn't take into account that, for example, if you are a black woman in the USA or Hispanic woman in the USA, the pay gap is much larger than it is compared to that overall gender pay gap. If you're a disabled woman in Canada or an Indigenous woman in Canada, again, the gender pay gap tends to be much larger than the overall figure. So we are working with our affiliates to get that data. That's the first thing, is to ensure that whenever you're talking equality, you really need to look under the stone, if you like, and say, okay, what is it that we're actually looking at, talking about, and what information, what data are we gathering in order to be able to ensure that we're really getting to the root of issues. I can't really provide a straightforward answer to the disability question and how these two interact or intersect, being a woman and, you know, social norms around gender and social norms around disability. But in some of the work and research that we've been doing with affiliates, for example, in Zimbabwe, where it was the Women's Committee of the national affiliate that decided it wanted to do some real work around organizing disabled workers and challenging the norms that exist in society around disabled people generally and disabled workers in particular. I mean, the situation was quite horrific. You can't really, you know, gloss over it. It was quite horrific, not only in the fact that employers, of course, just did not see disabled people as being potential employees, but the way that they were perceived by society as not really being full and productive members of society. So them having to do that groundwork, trying to change those norms, both by going into communities and actually working with disabled people in those communities, and then working with employers to say, well, you need to put in place some measures that are going to assure that disabled workers have access to employment, also bringing a rather dysfunctional government, but trying to bring the government into that as well is part of the work that they've been doing now. And that's one example. There are other examples I could give you from around the world on that. So I think in order not to take up too much time, I'll stop there.
Okay, Rachel, do you want to?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, also on the intersectionality issues, one of the clear findings from this Scan of the Grove studies was how little disaggregation there was. Some of the main lens was really around age and looking at particular issues for young married women as opposed to older groups, but not in with detailing particularly issues for older women, more just looking at that young married segment in particular, and the specific and particularly extreme constraints that they faced. I don't think any of the studies mentioned anything to do with disability. I wondered if, Ian, you might like to comment on where the studies came from and, you know, why they did or didn't have certain lenses. No. Okay. No.
Maybe I'll come back to it later.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments?
Well, I mean, around the changing nature of work, I think that, you know, how it looks on a global scale and how it plays out locally are often quite different. So in the studies, you know, there were certainly new opportunities coming up that from a global perspective about, you know, major shifts in the nature of work. They might not be reflected, but it was quite new in those given contexts. For example, that there was mining, or that women were taking up, in some cases, more technical opportunities such as driving or carpentry, typically on a small scale. And then, of course, we've seen from other studies about kind of changing patterns of work and outsourcing of things like call centres and so on, that those create certain opportunities for women because they're seen as clean and safe sort of work to do at the aggregate level, though in any given context people know whether actually that is safe work, whether they're going to be harassed on the way, whether what their conditions will be like when they're working there. So I think that doesn't really answer your question very much, but it's mainly to say that I think in any given context people were sort of assessing the pros and cons of any particular work opportunity, and if the financial benefits were enough, I think there was a shift that enabled women to go into those areas of work, but with a lot of caveats around it, and with people not necessarily being fully subscribed to the shift, but thinking, well, that's what needs to happen at the moment because we need the money.
Marilyn, do you want to comment on one or two of those questions? We will take more questions if you want to wait.
Hello, the reception is a little bit poor. I didn't catch the question well.
I didn't catch that, did I? Okay, so I'm going to move. Did you want to make a comment?
No, I said I had trouble with hearing. The reception is a bit poor.
Okay, so I'm going to take another round of questions, and if you can't hear them, then please do ask, and I'll repeat one or two of them for you. I see we've got some more questions on the floor, and then I'm going to ask a few of the online ones. A lot of questions.
Eni Liazi,
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Eni Liazi, a graduate student in economics at the LSE, and I was wondering more in general about returns to education, in that there are studies that show that more and more young women are going into higher education, and in some fields outperforming their male counterparts. So I was wondering if effects of that you think or expect are going to be shown in the near future, or already have, or without any changes in power structures, regardless of how well women do, we will not see a change in the disbalance, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Rebecca Terzian from DFID. I'd just be really interested in hearing any reflections on, or further reflections, I guess, on anything that we can be doing to quicken the pace of change on social norms, and I suppose on the flip side, anything we can be doing to minimise the backlash that we've talked about as well. There's no one easy answer, of course, but it would be interesting to hear any reflections on that. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Abigail Hunt. I'm a research fellow here at ODI. My question is for Chidi. I mean, I really love the investing in the care economy pieces. I think they're really interesting pieces of work. But I'm really interested from your point of view if you think they've had a particular traction or policy resonance because they're essentially economic analysis and because they're making a very robust financial case for investing in the care economy. I'm really interested if you've found that that's had a particular resonance in the care economy debate.
Hi, I'm Rebecca from Care International, and I work in our Women's Economic Empowerment team. And my question was around, I think with gender norms, it can feel like it's everyone's and no one's problem. So I was wondering if in the research there were any findings on specifically on the role of business in changing gender norms.
To put in two online questions around safety at work. One from Kelly. How do the speakers see the Me Too movement and the issue of safeguarding after years of gender equality advocacy and commitments to women's rights since Beijing? What is different that is making institutions, men, women, donors take women's safety and well-being more seriously? And another similar one from Anya Glass at Plan International. Given all of the challenges Chidi laid out, what needs to be done between now and June 2019 to make sure that the new ILO standards on violence and harassment in the world of work are strong mechanisms to address the issue? So I think we've got 6 questions, which is quite a lot. Don't feel you have to answer all of them. So just pick out some. And I will come back to Marilyn and ask you 1 or 2 more specific questions at the end. So Chidi, can I start with you?
Okay, thanks. Maybe I'll start with your question first because it's quite easy to do it, to address it. But the ILO has a wealth of information and material on this, and one of their latest reports, which is about the trends of women at work, shows that indeed the education gap between men and women is pretty much closed now. And yet we're not seeing that, transforming into the position of women in the labour market because we still have what they call the unexplained gender gaps around discrimination, around social norms, etc. So unless we start to tackle those, then, it's not about the disparity between women and men's participation, including around pay, is not about women's education levels. It is about addressing that discrimination and those social gendered norms that follow us into the workplace. In terms of the impact of the care economy reports, I'm happy to say that yes, it is actually having an impact. It's been a long, hard slog, but it's starting to have an impact, both in terms of policy making, but in terms of the advocacy work that the trade unions, our affiliates, are doing as well. A quick example would be in Ghana, where the trade union confederation is working with the government on the issue of investment in care as being central to social and economic development and to actually fulfilling the SDGs. I mean, we know we have these goals in the SDGs, especially Goal 5, on equality, which also includes tackling unpaid care work. And we have Goal 8 on decent work, and they've made the link very well with all of these, and are making the argument with the government that if you're actually serious about having a development policy, then you actually really have to put care at the center of it, because your society, your people, etc., are not really going to develop in the way that you might want them to if you don't do that. I wanted quickly, I think there was another question that was addressed, but I'm afraid I can't really remember what it was. But if I can quickly just mention the issue about the future of work, because there might be a link to that. As Emanuela from the ILO said, a lot of the future of work discussion revolves around technology and the 4th industrial revolution. But the care economy really is going to be the fastest growing sector and probably the most human resource after agriculture, the most human resource intensive sector. So having a good focus on that and ensuring that the jobs that are created in that economy are gendered jobs, that they're jobs that tackle occupational segregation, so how the work, which is often perceived as women's work and is valued as women's work, actually having no real value other than an intrinsic one, is usually how care work is perceived, needs to change. And that's also work that we're doing as trade unions, so global unions, which would include the ITUC and sectoral global federations, including, for instance, the International Transport Federation, Public Services International, Education International. These are all unions coming together to work on the care economy quite specifically and how it can help break down some of these really persistent social and gendered norms. And I know I didn't really tackle the question of age, but we are doing a lot of work on gender and age, and again, looking at the issue of equal pay for work of equal value and how that translates into women's ability to earn fairly throughout their life cycle. but also what happens when you get to the end of that life cycle, and how that discrimination impacts your ability to A, even have a pension in the first place, but B, have a pension that reflects the fact that you have contributed, to society at large, if not to a particular employer, during that life cycle. So it's all very interwoven and very complicated. But as I said earlier, if you're not really deliberate about trying to address these issues, then they just don't get addressed at all. They just, fall by the wayside.
Great. There were a couple of questions on violence and harassment in the workplace.
Yes. What needs to be done between now and 2019 is actually a lot of discussions with employers and governments need to be had. We still have a lot of resistance from many employers, but when you actually talk to employers who are working in the real economy, as we put it, many of them do realize that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. But we also have an ideological stand in this neoliberal global economies that we have, which is deregulation, deregulation, deregulation. So absolutely no new regulation, even if they can see that it's going to be a benefit to them in terms of ensuring minimal reputational damage around these issues, in terms of avoiding court cases when employees are subjected to violence and harassment. But the ideological notion of deregulation, and certainly no new regulation, is very strong. So having these conversations, putting out examples from employers who are working on this and who are actually putting in place procedures, policies aimed at rooting out violence and harassment will be important. And calling governments to account, that's the most important thing, because we have too many governments who came to the ILO this year and really were just not there to actually do what they needed to do to ensure that women in particular can go to work without having to be afraid of being subjected to violence and harassment. So yeah, I think making it as visible as possible, the fact that this is something that will be decided on next year, the fact that governments really have to get behind this, not letting them off the hook in terms of them being supportive of the process and supporting the standards, is crucial for us.
Great, thank you. I'm going to Marilyn, I don't know if you can hear clearly, but I'm going to ask you one specific question. So there was a question about educational improvements and whether that is showing up in changes that you're seeing on the ground. Are you able to comment on that?
Maybe a little bit briefly. I think, and the two things I wanted to comment about some previous questions. I think we are seeing girls, and I'll give my own example. There's been a lot of affirmative action initiatives giving girls extra points to get into the university. Personally, in law school, there were more girls in the class than the boys, but in practice, when you look for the women, you kind of get lost elsewhere. Some of us are in the development world, but there is a lot of progress, and when girls are given the opportunity to perform, they do tend to perform very strongly and competitively against their male counterparts. I think that there's a lot of positive results coming out of that. I want to say something that I've had comments in different fora when we have programs for girls, and then we see girls outperforming boys, for example, in our business plan competition. I've had comments from people saying that we have left the boys behind. There's no programming for boys, and girls are becoming stronger and stronger. They're performing very well. We're seeing lots of strong, professional women. And also I've seen some stories about, Black women in the developing world, in the developed world, and that they're having struggles finding, mates of the same, who share the same values and who appreciate a woman of that caliber. And this is something that I've had before, and I think that maybe there's need to also, as we support women to grow, there is some sort of need for some sort of intervention to help the men from the time that they are boys to appreciate a partner of that caliber and to appreciate why the efforts have been made towards women. There's a sort of some little bit of, not really animosity, but they're not very, perhaps they don't appreciate why girls are being given that effort, that attention and those extra, why they're being encouraged to participate more. I feel like there might be some room for some intervention, some sensitization for the men as they grow up and into their adulthood and as they enter the workforce for what kind of relationship you have with a female boss and how that should not shock you very much and how you should treat her the same way you treat your male boss. There's some small things around that I think we could maybe look into.
Thank you very much. Rachel, your comments?
Yeah, I'll pick up a couple of questions. One was about the role of business. Only one of the studies addressed this, but it was very interesting. The study of mining in East Africa looked at 3 countries and 3 different kinds of mines, and one of them was a lot more formal than the other 2. And in the formal mine, there had been a notable problem of sexual harassment, and then the at the local level, the company received directions from their head office that they needed to stamp it out, and so the foreman was reported as saying, well, you know, you've got to stop this. If not, you're going to lose your jobs. And it made a major change. Essentially, it stopped, or it became much more low level. And I mean, it really showed the power of people dealing with the threat of losing their jobs, and a company taking committed action on it. On the question of how can we speed up change, I think, as we've heard, this is an area where challenges are really entrenched. Like Caroline said at the beginning, it's a question of giving up power. It's perhaps much more challenging than some other areas of work. And I think because of that, there's no one magic bullet there. There's never a magic bullet, but I think it's a real combination of a lot of different structural things to do with education, to do with widening opportunities, and laws, proper implementation of laws, activism, demanding change, women's empowerment initiatives that give women and girls the confidence to speak out and demand change, work with men and boys to change masculinities, to promote more gender equitable ways of living. You know, all of these can be reinforced through the media, and there are some good examples of programs that have done this and have been really innovative in changing norms and attitudes. Just to pick up one because it's working with the young generation, school-based programs such as Taron Kitoli in India, but there are many of these which work with clubs within schools and introduce a gender equality curriculum. Sometimes that's through formal lessons, but more often after school activities, getting young people to rethink what they know about gender, what their expectations are for the future, boys what they're looking for in a wife, girls what they expect their future roles to be. And an evaluation of that specific program and many others have found that they've led to real shifts in ideas about what work is acceptable for women to do, what they expect to be doing themselves when they're older, what they expect their family relationships to be like when they're older. It would be really interesting to see whether those young people whose ideas have changed quite considerably are able to carry that through into adult life, or if the change was in attitudes but didn't really translate any further.
Thank you, Rachel. We're close to the end of our session. I'll take one, maybe 2 questions, and then ask the panel to sum up if there are any pressing questions. Oh goodness, there's so many hands. I'm just going to take 2 of you. So one over here and one over here. There's one at the back.
I think we haven't had any men, so I think we should be.
Yes, please.
So representing men. Okay, so my name's Peter. I work for DFID as well on the land policy team. And if we talk about economic empowerment, we can talk about income, and we can also talk about assets. And of course, land policy, we're talking about assets a lot. We've heard a lot about women's economic empowerment in terms of getting into the workforce, getting a source of income, but I was happy to hear someone, I can't remember who, touch a bit on assets and the fact that across the world, often assets are just owned by men in the family. So if a woman becomes a widower, often she might not have ownership over the land, over the livestock, over in an urban environment, whatever that asset is. So I wondered if there's any reflections on how to change gender norms over asset ownership, as well as just over income.
Thank you. And a question over here.
Oh. Sorry. Hi. Thank you to all the speakers. My name is Anam Pervez, and I work at Oxfam. I have a specific question for Rachel, and we can also take this offline. But I wondered whether you came across any instances of positive deviance in the GROW research, so cases of groups of people defying norms around care specifically, and what made it possible, or what was different about them, and whether we can learn something from those kinds of cases for sort of pathways to change.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask the panelists to sum up. There's one question here from Dimpy at DFID, also asking a similar question which was asked earlier, about how we can catalyse change without offending traditions, how we can speed things up a bit. But maybe you can just incorporate that within your final comments. Marilyn, I'm actually not going to ask you to speak because the connection really isn't bad enough, but you did talk about assets and control over assets, and I wonder if you could perhaps just send us some written comments that we could put up online, because the connection isn't really good enough for us to hear you, but I know you did talk about assets and control over assets. So I'm actually...
I'll do that.
Okay, thank you, that would be great, and we'll put that up online in the next 24 hours. So I'm going to ask the two people we have in the room to make some concluding comments, reflecting also on the last questions. Can I move to you first?
Okay, thank you. I don't know how to sum that all up in conclusion, but maybe can point you all in the direction of a publication that came out of a panel that was put together by the UN to drive women's economic empowerment, in fact, and in order to accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly those that relate to gender equality. But not only, because I think the work of that panel is really useful in identifying some of the levers that we can use to accelerate progress. It's certainly something that we use all the time in terms of our social dialogue, advocacy, and the work with our affiliates. I also perhaps just want to wrap up by looking to the future. And I think somebody also asked about, well, where are we going from here? How do we react in the face of the backlash that is being experienced globally? And wanted to link that also to the issue of the future of work, which I didn't really touch on, because we're seeing it play into this. We're seeing a future where work is more precarious, where online platforms are playing a bigger role, so there's no employer at the end of it. It's just everybody is in work for themselves, everybody's an individual independent contractor, and all of that brings with them. Because if you look into the future and say, well, if none of us are actually playing into a pension pot because we're all independent contractors and all responsible for our own social protection, there's no collective pot that we're paying into, then we have a really, not a pleasant picture ahead of us, let's say. But in terms of gender norms, I mean, apart from, and I don't want to talk about digital gaps or digital divides, but we are seeing the fact that technology will play such a big part in the future of work, also having a role in this pushback against the role of women. So, for instance, we're talking about violence and harassment, and the solution suddenly is, well, women will be able to work from home. They don't need to go into a physical workplace, so we don't really need to worry about this. We talk about the care economy. Well, they will be able to work from home again, so they'll be able to look after their children from home, so we don't need to worry about putting childcare in place or even elderly care, because they can look after their dependent relatives at the same time as doing, the work in front of their computer. So I think all of these things are things, again, that we need to be alive to and really need to be pushing back against as we're striving to achieve real gender equity and equality.
Rachel,
I'm just going to respond on the positive deviance, because I think Chidi's comments have really encapsulated anything else I could possibly say to sum up. So the growth studies didn't set out to look at norms, and so they weren't probing things like positive deviance, but what did come up was where women had been able to take on new roles. The key critical factor seemed to be a supportive family, and the family had become supportive either because they saw economic advantage in themselves for doing it, largely because of that. In some cases, there had been some sustained efforts to work with power holders such as husbands, sometimes also mother-in-laws, people who were really objecting to the younger woman going out to do a particular kind of job and work, and showing them that actually it wasn't, lots of women were doing this, so it was partly the showing the social norm that their daughter-in-law wasn't the only one to be doing this. and partly showing the kinds of benefits to the family. I think also some of the young women involved, it created an enormous strain on them. You know, they were positive deviants in the sense that they were blazing a trail, but they kind of overcompensated by bringing their parents-in-law presents whenever they went to market, by showing a really exaggerated sense of duty within the household, to provide really good care and excellent cooking and everything else along with their other responsibilities. So I think maybe that's just sort of concluding comment that the focus has been on enhancing women's access to the labour market, and the competing demands of care have come up a lot, but the reality in terms of their lives was very much of an enhancement of double burden, as well as the empowering benefits that they certainly perceive by going to work.
Great, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our session. I think the presence in the room and online is testament to how important this issue is going forward and for the future of work. So thank you very much for all your contributions. Thank you, panel. There'll be a video of this up tomorrow, and we'll also incorporate any written comments that we get from any of the panelists for you to see there. We do have a social outside the room if you want to stay and talk to the panelists and other guests, so please do join us. Thank you also to our sponsors, IDRC, and others, DFID and others who funded the research that prompted that prompted the report that we did on norms. It's really great to bring together norms with economic issues around employment and assets and ownership of land and other assets. So very important progress, I think, in the discussion that we're having around change in this area. So thank you all very much, and thank you, panelists.